Welcome to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. The world of finance can be intimidating to many. We hear the term capital markets, but what exactly are they? And have you ever wondered what the role of a stock market is in capital markets? And how does a company become publicly traded? And what are the challenges faced by women-led public companies? There is a lot to unpack and discuss today with my guest, Mary Anne Palangio. She's the Chief Financial Officer at the Canadian Securities Exchange and a Spirit Award winner from the CFA Society in Toronto. Mary Anne, welcome.
Thank you so much, Liz. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm so excited to talk to you today. You and I are friends and we have lunches together, but this is a little bit different. And I want to pick your brain now for our future female leaders. So to begin with, I just want to understand, how did you get to where you are today?
I took the scenic route for sure. I started out in public accounting, focused on the financial services industry, and then spent about 8 years there, left and worked in progressively more senior roles, again, in financial services companies like pension funds, mutual fund companies, insurance companies, private equity firms, venture capital funded firms. And then took a short stint doing 7 years heading up global IT teams with a global insurance company, and then came back to my roots being the CFO of 2 publicly traded companies, taking one of them public. And along the way, got my CFA, as you mentioned, and sat on the board of the CSE from 2016 before coming on board as the CFO in 2020.
You know, it's funny because I took the scenic route as well. And I think a lot of women who are in leadership positions end up taking this longer scenic route. There are no shortcuts.
There are not. There are not. And there's no wrong turns along the way, that scenic route. Like, I don't regret any of those changes along the way.
Yeah, I don't think I regret any as well, because it's all a learning experience, right? Whichever avenue you end up taking, it's a learning experience.
Absolutely.
So what I want to do now is I want you to explain capital markets and what do they do for us? Because you hear capital markets a lot in the finance industry. It's like bread and butter.
Right.
However, when you're outside of the finance industry, people don't understand what capital markets actually are and what they do.
And it's a big question. So it'll have to be the Reader's Digest version for sure. So capital markets are really critical, as you know, to the functioning of the Canadian economy. Capital markets really allow for businesses, entrepreneurs to raise money, to expand their businesses, to create jobs, to invest in new projects, to acquire other companies. That all feeds into the economy. And along the way, it allows investors, individuals, institutions, et cetera, to accomplish their needs in terms of financial, build wealth, save for retirement, save for education, et cetera. And then, really enables free trading. So there needs to be liquidity in that. There needs to be trust in the capital markets and stock exchanges that fair market prices are going to be made available for those investments that people have made, and that there's fair transparency. So all of that leads towards a stable, trustworthy environment for the economy and the capital markets.
And yes, the Reader's Digest version was excellent because there is a lot to unpack here when you start talking about capital markets. But what about the role of the Canadian Securities Exchange in the Canadian capital markets?
For sure. Canadian Securities Exchange plays a critical role along the way. So not only do we enable companies, small, large, medium, to go public and raise that capital to fund their businesses, create those jobs, we also allow for that trading for the investors themselves to have a marketplace where there's supply and demand and trust that there's a fair price for what they're doing. We also have rules and policies for disclosures that the companies need to do so that the information is readily available for those investors.
So we have less than a minute left before we go to commercial break. So I'll ask you this question. What have been the recent challenges and opportunities in the Canadian public markets so far?
I know a lot would say the geopolitical uncertainty, but I think more would say it's been the interest rate environment. That has hampered the ability for individual investors in particular to have the cash to be able to do investing. So smaller companies are having trouble raising capital. There's not a lot of trading going on as much in those smaller companies. So it's really that interest rate environment that I think has been the challenge, but also presents some opportunities going forward.
That's really interesting because, somebody outside of the markets wouldn't think that interest rates were so prominent in it. So Don't go away. We'll be right back with more of Canadian capital markets. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. On today's episode, we're discussing capital market exchanges and women-led public companies. Now, Mary Anne, before we went to the break, I had asked you a question. What have been the recent challenges and opportunities in the Canadian public markets? And you talked about the challenges. What about the opportunities?
I think one of the great opportunities for the Canadian marketplace in particular right now is the growth of the continued electrification of the economy and, the coming online of battery plants that we've seen. And there's a huge opportunity, and we've seen a lot of new companies coming to market in the mining space in particular for critical battery minerals and metals. Not that that's a big place where women tend to play a big role, but we're hoping to see more and more of that. And I think in particular, Canadian companies have a great opportunity, whether they're mining in Canada or internationally.
So how does an executive team at a company go about taking their company public? Because you talk about, or people have talked about, private companies versus publicly traded companies. But what if somebody watching has a private company and they think, I want to take it to the next level, but it's way too complicated. I don't know what to do.
That's a great question. And it's, fairly well articulated in terms of what the process is. We have it all on our website, and it's fairly consistent across the board. You need to be a reporting issuer in a jurisdiction in Canada. There are qualifying requirements that one needs to meet. There are, documents that need to be filed. So it does take a bit of a village. There is some heavy lifting. There needs to be involvement from investment bankers, dealers, lawyers, accounting firms. And it's really important to look at those requirements ahead of time, because sometimes it takes some time, including like needing 3 years of audited financial statements and all the disclosures that are required in order to go public. But it's a tried and true sort of process, and the exchange works very well with all of those advisors that assist companies in doing that.
Well, it doesn't sound as onerous and arduous that it may play in people's minds. So I want to talk about the statistics of numbers of women CEOs of publicly traded companies.
Very consistent with one of your earlier shows that talked about women on boards. Mm-hmm. The numbers are not big. And in terms of percentages, it's keeping about the same, but that doesn't mean the numbers aren't improving. So they are still small. TSX listed companies, the top 60, there are no female CEOs there. So we continue to see very small numbers of female CEOs in publicly traded companies. Even though the number of companies is growing, the percentage of female CEOs is not necessarily growing at the same pace.
I'm actually surprised that there aren't any female-led CEOs.
In the top 60.
In the top 60. That's surprising to me. I know that NYSE, NASDAQ, they all have guidelines set that you need X amount of females or diversity, equity, inclusion. They've got this whole thing put together for their boards and their CEOs. Do we have such a thing in Canada?
Absolutely, we do. In 2014, the Ontario Securities Commission actually had done some consultation and put out some requirements involving disclosure of women participation on boards and executive levels at publicly traded companies. It was more a disclose or explain why. There's been some follow-on consultations and roundtables, both by the Canadian Securities Administrators and by the OSC. It is largely about reporting and not necessarily having targets. And there's continuing conversation around what's the impact of that? What impact is that driving on the disclosure front? And what impact would targets have? So there is continuing conversations at the regulatory level there.
So I know that Globe and Mail has, it's a yearly thing that they do. It's a survey, and it's Women Lead Here.
Yes.
And they will grant a company the Women Lead Here logo if they have, top C-suite, female-led companies that are publicly traded, which I think is really good, because I think it helps companies get to that next level.
Absolutely. So, while saying that there is a requirement to report and not necessarily have targets, we really have seen a move forward in the numbers as a result of some of the work the regulators have done here in Canada.
So again, less than a minute to go to the commercial break, but I want to talk about the average returns for women-led companies compared to index returns. What are they?
So there's some great research and numbers out there showing that women-led companies, again, the numbers I have are from TSX-listed companies, where the returns from 2020, for instance, were 10 and 20% higher than the relative composite indices. Now, that sounds great, and there's lots of other reports that support that. I think the important thing is to dig through the details and understand that we're comparing apples to apples in all of this research. But there are multiple reports that support that, and it's important for people to understand that the details are critical to understand really why is that.
Okay, well, we'll be right back with more of capital markets, securities exchanges, and women-led companies. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. On today's episode, we're discussing capital markets, exchanges, and women-led public companies. So speaking of, what are the challenges faced by women-led public companies right now?
I think it's that, again, it's the perfect storm of women-led companies being such a smaller percentage of the companies out there and being such a smaller percentage of the capital being raised by those companies out in the public markets. So it's, again, consistent with how do we raise the money? How do we tell the story? How do we, get over some of the historical biases that still might be out there in terms of the firms that are working with public companies and then those women-led companies who are dealing with, venture capital firms or firms that are investment banks that tend to be a lot of male-dominated teams who are making the decisions around who they're going to raise money for, where they're going to invest.
And there have been so many women in the financial industry trying to change those biases. And sometimes it's almost like it's never going to happen.
It's a long arc, right? But it's bending towards where it needs to be.
Slowly,
exactly.
Yeah.
It's a long arc, but it is moving in the right direction, and it's obviously not feeling like it's moving as quickly as any of us would like, but it's getting there.
No, let's hope so. So I want to talk about why the numbers of women executives continue to be low. There's a lot of smart women out there, a lot of women with CFAs, a lot of women that are running companies, even though there's been so much going forward these days for women. We're out there. However, the numbers for women executives are always low.
Agreed. And I think, again, it's looking in particular at the details, right? The percentages tend to stay fairly flat, but because there's increases in the number of companies, et cetera, the actual raw numbers tend to be going up, offset by, I think you've discussed this before on your show, women leaders are leaving the industry in record numbers. And the real challenge is we don't have the depth of the pipeline behind of women coming up to take on those roles for a whole host of reasons, right? Mm-hmm. The pandemic was part of it. The definition of capital markets and do people understand that there's a whole lot of breadth of opportunity for women there in different roles to be in capital markets and work their way towards those leadership positions.
I think you just touched upon something that's really important because we have interns that come in from all the business schools, and they all have been focused on being an equity analyst. And they don't understand that there are so many other roles out there for women. And I don't know whether they don't teach it in university, they don't know that these roles are there for them. But I find that everyone's focused on becoming an equity analyst, but there are so many other roles for women in finance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not just in, finance or at an asset management firm, but at those advisors that assist companies in going public. The investment bankers, the accounting firms, the lawyers, they all play a role, and there's all very big roles for women to play in those opportunities. And like myself, for instance, I'm the financial officer, which is another role that is needed in every company that's going public.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's an important role as well.
It is.
So as a female leader in a traditionally male-dominated industry, how do you see the role of women evolving in finance? So this is kind of like the next step of what we just talked about.
Absolutely. And it is a nice segue because it is very much making sure that we inform those women who are coming up and in university and graduating all about all those opportunities that are available to them, and have mentors and education sessions and ability to have exposure, for them to have exposure to all of those various roles. And I think it's going to happen.
It's interesting that you just said mentors, because practically every woman that sits in that chair talks about mentorship and talks about the importance of having a mentor. And I don't know whether the next generation coming up actually understand mentorships.
I think that's a great point. And particularly for those who have gone through a lot with the last few years with the pandemic, they haven't had that opportunity to be exposed, whether formally or informally. And I think it's important to make sure that we dust that off and make sure it's available for those folks.
I think so too. And I think when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about, increase of number of women going into capital markets. But I think one of the key things too is we need to be able to make decisions. Whether they're right or wrong, it doesn't matter. You still need to make a decision so that you can move on and learn from it. So please don't go away. We'll be right back with more capital markets, exchanges, and women-led publicly traded companies. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. On today's episode, we're discussing capital markets, exchanges, and women-led public companies. And I'm joined by Mary Anne Palangio, who's the Chief Financial Officer at the Canadian Securities Exchange. So, Mary Anne, let's continue. In your view, what can be done to increase the number of women getting funded, particularly in capital markets?
It starts with the early stage, startup funding, where historically, and there's research on this as well, where women-led startups tend to get far fewer investments and 6 times less the amount of funding that a similar company that a man would raise. It's huge. And again, I think it's something we talked about earlier is, the folks who are making the decision around those funding tend to be led by teams of men. So back to the various roles that women can and should be looking at and companies should be looking at in terms of broadening their diversity includes those firms that make those decisions, because that will then drive which companies go on to grow bigger, to go public, and be a critical part of the economy.
And that's happening as well with investment advisors in our industry. There's such a push to hire female investment advisors because women will relate to them more. And I can tell you that people are having a hard time finding female investment advisors, just as they are in capital markets as well. So what initiatives has the industry taken right now?
I think, aside from the regulatory initiatives and, some of the individual things the regulators are doing and companies are doing, the industry itself has a number of associations, et cetera. There's Women in Capital Markets that has a number of programs and initiatives. There are a whole host of various companies, and most of the big players in capital markets are partners and fund and participate. And I think one of the things that we need to be looking at is how to look at it more holistically and broadly. Everyone's doing good work. Everyone's doing it a bit sort of not connected and disjointed. How do we leverage all of that great stuff that's going on and work perhaps together to move it even further, faster?
So what initiatives, I can't speak today, what initiatives has the Canadian Securities Exchange taken?
So we're definitely participating in the roundtables from the regulators. We were part of the consultation for the CSA. We participated, we give our feedback, we sponsor, we bring in interns, we have rotational programs. And, we have 25% of our executive management team is women, and our non-executive board members are also 25% women.
That's great. So what are you doing? What initiatives have you taken?
So recently, I was a mentor last year through Women in Capital Markets.
I've been a mentor as well, Women in Capital Markets, and it's fulfilling on both sides.
Well, I got as much out of it, or perhaps more,
100%,
than the person I was mentoring. And we're going to keep in touch. So that I'm an advisor with Room Women's Network, which is a recently launched initiative focused really on making room for women. Women need room for empowerment, et cetera. So working with them and really creating that opportunity, focused very highly on that pipeline. I volunteer, I participate, I volunteer on the CFA Society, I participate in CCMA, on T+1 initiatives. So it's being visible.
I'm on that one too.
Right? It's like, yeah. So it's really taking part in things that are outside of your realm of your core group of responsibilities for your job, both at work and outside of work.
And I think that's really important. The important thing is to give back. And I think when you get to a certain level in your career, you want to give back because you want that next generation to be better than you and be more successful than you. Last few seconds left. Advice for younger women entering the finance or capital market space.
I think it's participate, it's be visible. It's you said it earlier, make a decision and then execute on it. Speak up. Just do all the things that you want to do, and don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to take some risks. Don't be afraid to make a decision and have it not work out. All of those things are learning experiences.
So basically, the last words are don't be afraid.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was wonderful.
It was great.
Today, we discussed risk awareness, asking questions, and the imposter syndrome. Regardless of how successful or powerful my guests are, these three topics keep coming up with every empowered discussion. So don't let the negative talk in your head keep you from succeeding. As Mary Anne mentioned, mentoring and networking are important. Participate in industry initiatives and create visibility for yourself. Don't be afraid. Take that risk. Stretch yourself. Take yourself to that very, very next level. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski, and I'm here to empower you and make frugality fashionable. Bye for now.